Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Handy Philosopher. This one's going to be a little bit different in that I'm going to be explaining a concept of science called evolution. You might have heard of it. Um, for those of you in class at the moment, we've just had a look at Popper and Kuhn and their views of how science progresses. So just very quickly, Kuhn argues that science isn't really progressing towards one final truth, but rather science progresses on a path of revolution via paradigm shift. So remember, this is when the entire scientific framework of a specific area of science changes based on new evidence that's produced. Okay. Um, Compared to Popper, who sort of agrees with Kuhn that we're not progressing towards any single scientific truth, but rather that we're progressing away from what we might call scientific ignorance. Okay, so as science progresses, we eliminate incorrect information. And we'll probably never get to the point of eliminating all incorrect information, but every time a hypothesis is disproven, or as he would say, falsified, um, then this is a valuable addition to our understanding of how the world or the universe is not. So Kuhn, remember, for Kuhn, the entire process of science is there to solve our problems. That's why we do science, so that we can find solutions to our problems. Whereas for Popper, it is more so to better understand the universe. And for him, the best way we can do that is by eliminating things that are incorrect. Okay. Um, so we've completed both the readings on Popper and Kuhn now. And if you haven't gone through them, there are screencasts of those as well. So please make sure that you go through them at some point and take notes. What we're going to be doing today is applying Popper and Kuhn's theory to the scientific theory of evolution. And really, what we're going to be asking is whether evolution is a scientific theory. Okay, I've got scientific there in inverted commas. Um, uh, so we're really talking about, like, does this count as science from Kuhn and Popper's point of view? Okay. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the theory of evolution, at least some of the more, not so much nitty-gritty stuff, but you might have a basic understanding, but I wanted to go into just a little bit of detail. Now, I'll preface this as saying I am not a biology teacher. I am someone who's very interested in science and does read a bit about science, but apologies for any mistakes I might make. Um, uh, so, to run through how evolution works. Okay, we've got a lovely colorized picture of Charles Darwin there, the person who's really credited with developing the first complete theory of evolution. Okay, so Darwin, through his observations, particularly of certain bird life, argued that an organism will make changes uh, one generation after the next to better interact with its environment. And that over many years, and we're talking about millions, if not billions of years, that these changes can then have drastic or result in drastic differences between different organisms when they actually originated from the same basic ancestor. Okay, so Charles Darwin first outlined the process of evolution, and whilst he didn't coin this phrase, he did adopt it later in the first published works of his famous book Origin of Species. He didn't use this phrase. He did in other publications when he adopted it. So evolution has been summarized as survival of the fittest. This, it's worth noting, isn't quite right from a modern evolution perspective, because fittest seems to imply some sort of idea about the strongest or the fastest. And this actually isn't the case. Um, Evolution through natural selection is the concept of survival of the best suited. Um, so if we mean that when we say fittest, then that's fine. It's survival of the fittest. We don't need to split hairs on this. But we just need to be very careful that we're not confusing fittest with something like strongest or fastest. Um, because sometimes being the strongest is not evolutionarily prudent. Okay, in other words, sometimes being the strongest isn't the best way to interact with your environment. Sometimes being the fastest is not the best way to interact with your environment. So it's really about organisms that develop in a way that best meets the demands of their environment will survive better. And if we think about this, what do we mean when an organism survives better? Well, they are generally healthier, they will live longer, and then therefore they will also have more opportunities to breed. Okay, and this is now where we get into one of the real cornerstones of evolution, which is the process of natural selection. Okay, so natural selection suggests that the traits of an animal or an organism that allow it to live longer and breed more will then be passed on to its offspring, and its offspring will be able to live longer and breed more than the offspring of another organism that is less suited to the environment. As you do this over generations and generations and generations, remember we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, then what you end up with, hundreds of millions of years, what you end up with is significant change between one organism and another because of this process of natural selection. So because certain organisms are able to better interact with their environment, they are able to survive better and breed more. And so their genetic material gets taken into the next generation and the next and the next. And this leads to significant changes from one organism at one point of time to another. Okay, so we refer to this process as natural selection. I'll be using an example of unnatural selection next to help explain this. So if my explanation was a little bit disjointed, hopefully it'll be a bit clearer with the next slide. It's worth noting that we now identify other factors, whilst Charles Darwin really only focused on natural selection as the driving force of evolution. There are other factors that impact evolution and that scientists now have observed impacting evolution. One of the big ones that doesn't really get talked about a lot is a process referred to as genetic drift. So this is where an organism will change not because it is best, that's what allows for it to be best suited to its environment, but rather because of chance occurrences that happen. So for example, let's take as an example, if all pack ice melted on the planet, particularly all the land-based ice. Okay, so all glaciers melted on the planet, the water level would rise significantly. What would happen then is certain areas of the planet would become isolated because an area that was out of the water would now be under the water. And if you think about it, so let's imagine that I'm a land-based animal. Okay, at the moment, I can, walk, let's use the sort of the link between Africa and the Middle East as an example, okay, or Africa and Asia. At the moment, if I'm a land-based animal and I so chose to, I could literally walk from Africa over to Asia. Okay, now let's imagine that with the melting of the ice, I become isolated on the continent of Africa. I can now no longer get across to the continent of Asia, which means that my ability to interact with other organisms has drastically changed. Okay. In other words, I am now stuck in the area that I'm in. And what that means is it's going to limit who I can breed with. It's going to limit the type of food that I can access. It's going to limit the act, basically the activities or the actions I can perform because of all of this. So this is going to lead to changes in my well, not in my genetic makeup, but in the genetic makeup of my offspring and their offspring and their offspring, etc., etc. And so this is just a chance occurrence. Okay, so where a population becomes isolated, it's not so much that their genetic material is passed on based on survival of the best suited. It's actually passed on simply by the fact that, well, there was no one else to breed with. Okay, it's kind of like that moment in zombie movies where they always tend to sort of say, well, at some point it's going to be left to us to repopulate the earth. Okay, well, that weedy kid and the really attractive girl, I'm kind of thinking about Zombieland here. They're not going to breed together because they're best suited. They're going to breed together because they're the last ones around. So that will mean that the genetic material of their children has not been selected because it's the best genetic material for the environment that they now exist in. The genetic material of their children is going to be the makeup of the two of them simply because they were the only ones around. So when populations get isolated, this is a good example of what's referred to as genetic drift, a chance occurrence that's impacted the evolution of an organism, but is not survival of the best suited or natural selection. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We'll be focusing our discussion on natural selection, and it's certainly fair to say that the vast majority of evolution and evidence for evolution is based on natural selection, not genetic drift. These other occurrences do impact, but not as much as what is the real driving force of evolution, which is natural selection. Okay, so if this all sounds a little bit weird, let's talk about some evidence that we have of evolution. And because natural selection by definition is a natural process, in other words, it doesn't involve the manipulation by humans, we have to use an example of artificial selection, okay, or non-natural selection. And we've been doing this for many hundreds of years with through the form of domesticated animals. So pretty much all farm animals, all domestic pets like dogs and cats, a lot of breeds of birds. These have been domesticated. Okay, birds may be an exception to that actually, now that I think about it. But anyway, so these have been domesticated, and what we mean by that is humanity has impacted their breeding so that they develop particular traits, okay, that we find desirable. So in this case, we're kind of talking, so with natural selection, an organism is developing over generations so that it's better suited to its environment. With domestication of animals, we're talking about an organism developing over generations so that it's best suited to whatever the humans want it to do. Okay. Dog breeds for me are a perfect example of this. Okay. How do we get the variation in dog breeds? How do we get a Great Dane, the big dog that you can see on the screen, and a Jack Russell, the very, very little dog? And when you look at their faces, I could have gone for two vastly different dogs. You can actually see a lot of link in the makeup of their faces. They've both got the longer folded over ears. They've both got a long snout, but you can see the significant difference in body size. Okay, so why has this happened? Well, it's a relatively simple process, and any dog breeder or horse breeder or anyone who works with domesticated animals will be able to tell you that it's really not that difficult. What you do is, if I want a really big dog, like a Great Dane, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the largest of a litter of puppies and I'm going to breed it with the largest of another litter of puppies. And then from their offspring, I'm going to breed the largest of that with the largest of another breed and the largest, another litter. And then I'm going to breed the largest of that with another litter, so on and so forth. And this will get us to the point of a Great Dane. Okay, if I want a really little dog for whatever purpose it might serve, then the reverse. I pick the smallest. It's worth noting, particularly for any Jack Russell owners, if you've got a particularly aggro Jack Russell, they can be very aggressive dogs. And I often comment to my wife that if Jack Russells were a bit bigger, they'd probably be on the banned breed list or the restricted breed list, like pit bulls and things like that. It's worth noting that Jack Russells were used for hunting. The reason that they're so small is they were sent into things like rabbit burrows to scare out the rabbits and chase them out. So they are a very aggressive dog. That's exactly what they were bred for. They're not doing anything wrong. They're following their genetic makeup. This is why we bred them. So this is how we get such wide variety between breeds of domesticated animals. You know, how do we get a Chihuahua versus a Siberian Husky? How do we get a German Shepherd versus a Maltese Shih Tzu? Through artificial selection, so through humans purposefully breeding the offspring, or breeding dogs in this case, for a particular purpose. It could be for a particular look or a particular size. It could be for a particular purpose. For a long time, hunting dogs were a really core part of human civilization, particularly, all around the world. But if we looked at like the Western sort of tradition of hunting, then dogs were bred for a very specific purpose. There were dogs to chase the prey, and there were dogs to corner the prey, and these dogs had a very particular purpose. Okay, and this is why they developed differently. They were bred for that purpose. So really, in the variety of domestic animals we see, we have evidence that at least the theory of evolution is valid. Okay, so we know 100%, undeniably, we know that if you selectively breed an organism, you can change its genetic material. You can change its makeup, essentially. Okay, and we've known this for a very long time. So I'll pause here for a moment, and what I'd like you to do, I've got a link there to another YouTube video. This is a little talk by Richard Dawkins, who is a very well-respected and author of several books, very popular speaker, professor of evolutionary biology. So he's far more capable to explain this process than I am. And so if you pause for a moment, go to the video that's listed there, and listen to Richard Dawkins explaining the process of evolution, because he certainly knows a heck of a lot more about it than I do. Okay. All right, so hopefully you've had a look at the video by Richard Dawkins, and you've got a bit of a better understanding of how natural selection works, and sort of how that's reflected in artificial selection. I really like the example of the fox, I think it is it the fox, that he talks about in the video, where by selecting just for timidity in the fox, so trying to create a timid fox, in other words, a fox that you could have around, small children, you got a whole bunch of other traits that you didn't necessarily select for, but were carried along with timidity. So, a change in color, a change in ear shape, all of those sorts of things. I find that very, very interesting, quite fascinating. Um, so let's talk about the real bare bones basics of evolution. Okay, and this stuff's important to understand so that we know how evolution is tested and developed. Okay, and if you think back to both Kuhn and Popper, these are two really important things to understand. How is something tested and how did it develop? Um, what we've got here is essentially a geological um, history of the Earth. Okay, so we go from modern times up here, and then all the way down to the formation of the Earth, which was approximately 4.6 billion years ago. Okay, now this is based on dating of rock formations and things like that. Some of the oldest rock formations exist in uh, some of the most stable areas, so the most geologically stable areas. So on the continent of Australia, for example, particularly in Western Australia, there are rock formations that are several billion years old. In Canada, around Hudson Bay, there are rock formations that are reported to be the oldest on the planet. Okay, so we do have these rock formations present, and we can see them and measure them. Okay. What we know about the Earth is that there have been different periods that we have broken up like these are arbitrary breaks. Obviously, the Earth didn't change things, but arbitrary breaks that we've divided in the history of the Earth. Okay. Most important is the Cambrian stage here. Okay. So this is really the stage where life itself seems to have become more complex. So during the Cambrian stage, we start to get more complex organisms. Before this point, the only thing that we've really identified are things like bacteria. Okay, so very, very basic organisms. Now we start to get much more complex organisms. Okay, and you can see that this is about 500 million years ago. Yeah, just a lazy. Okay. Uh, uh, so the Cambrian stage is really the kind of like the beginning of the evolution of complex organisms. Okay. Life almost certainly began in water, okay, in the oceans, and then progressed towards land. This includes plant life. Okay, so plant life began in the ocean, and as the the geological structure of the Earth changed through things like continental drift, different areas got brought to the top, other areas got sunk, and this created pressure on different organisms to change, to evolve. Okay, so this very early stage of evolution, okay, begins with the Cambrian stage and ends with the Permian stage. Now, at this point, we get the largest extinction event in in Earth's history. Okay, the Permian evolution, where fossil records suggest that we came very, very close to all life on Earth going extinct. Okay, this was mostly due to some significant changes in the atmosphere of the Earth, which then changed, pretty much everything. The entire climate pattern of the Earth changed, and so this led to sweeping extinctions right across the planet of pretty much almost all living things. We then enter what we might call the dinosaur era. Okay, the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, or the Mesozoic period. Okay, so when we think of ancient history, or not even ancient history, but prehistoric history, a lot of the time we're really talking about and fascinated by this period. Okay, so the Mesozoic era. It's certainly the era that I am fascinated by ever since I was a kid and watched Jurassic Park for the first time. I've loved studying the Mesozoic era and the dinosaurs and things like that. It's certainly a nerdy love of mine. But what we see, so look at how complex organisms got to here, and then we almost revert back to a really basic level of organism. Now, the reason for this is that very few organisms survived the Permian extinction. So this is one of those chance occurrences that led to a significant change in the evolutionary timeline and process of life on Earth. It's no exaggeration to say that without the Permian extinction, and then, of course, without the extinction of the dinosaurs here, it's no exaggeration to say that we probably wouldn't exist, and most certainly wouldn't exist as the dominant species on the planet. Okay, but we'll talk more about that as we get closer to the top. So the life that is left over survives this giant extinction, and then the evolutionary process begins again. So we're now talking about a stretch of Earth's history that stretches from 65 million years ago to 250 million years ago. Okay, so this is no short period of time. All right. Uh, and we get the significant development of much more complex organisms here. We start to get a division of what we will later divide into really clear species. So we get the division of things like reptiles and mammals occurring during this stage. Okay. And notably, this is when the dinosaurs existed, which is awesome and cool. But we then get another chance occurrence. And whilst there may have been several factors, undoubtedly one of the biggest ones that impacted the extinction of the dinosaurs was a very large meteorite hitting the Earth, which then again affected the Earth's climate and led to the extinction of pretty much all of the large dinosaur species. Some certainly survived. There's lots of evidence to suggest that modern day sharks are simply variations on dinosaur sharks that existed. So their evolution has continued in a somewhat uninterrupted way. Crocodiles are another example of really a living dinosaur. They have continued to evolve along much the same path that they were before the meteorite hit that wiped out most of the dinosaurs. But the vast majority of land-based dinosaurs get wiped out at this point. Okay, at the a big extinction point as opposed to a gigantic extinction point. Most notably, what happens here is mammals go from being essentially nocturnal rodents in the Mesozoic era to being almost like the sole survivors of the Earth. Okay, not quite. There was plenty of other species that survived. I'm being somewhat tongue-in-cheek there. But what's really important here is that mammals, which were historically prey up to this point, now really lost most of their predators. This pushed a totally different path of evolution. And in the Cenozoic era, okay, so the era that leads to modern time, we get a completely different line of evolution, and particularly the age of mammals really begins here. We've gone from the age of the dinosaur to the age of mammals. And mammals really become the most, efficient or the best suited species on the planet. And they're able to populate widely around the planet. Okay, a certain breed of mammals does that better than others. And along that path, we eventually get to Homo sapien or human beings. Okay, and now we have certainly gotten to the point of dominance. Okay, and when you think of a human versus a Tyrannosaurus Rex, for example, there's no reason that you should be placing your money on the human to win that fight. What is it that's unique about us? Well, it's the development of traits that allowed us to survive in the environment a lot better. Okay, particularly traits around working together, around community, around language, and an understanding of basically like future planning. Okay, all of this developed from an evolutionary standpoint, so that we were better suited to survive, and it allowed us to survive lots of changes that occurred. 10,000 years ago, we've got, for example, the last of the woolly mammoths. We've still got saber-toothed tigers after that period, but 10,000 years ago is about the last ice age that occurred on the planet. And by that, I mean large-scale ice age. Most of Europe was under ice. The vast majority of the American continent, or the continent of North America, is under ice at this point. So how did we survive that when something like a mammoth didn't? Well, part of it is the interaction of the mammoths with what would become human beings. We hunted better, we worked together much better, and so we were able to adjust to our changing environment. So even though we got a significant change here in the Earth's climate, and we entered a large-scale ice age, we still survived and, if anything, thrived through this stage. Okay. So this takes us to where we're at the moment. Now, how do we know about this sort of thing, though? Well, I want you to imagine that this, for example, this line along here is the wall of the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon is a great example of an area of the Earth where you can see the layers of rock that have occurred. A little bit like, sort of like a stack of paper. Or if you're feeling hungry like I am, maybe a stack of pancakes. Pancakes. But we can see these layers, and we're able to identify these different layers in the Earth. We're able to extract things like fossils out of these layers of the Earth, and we're able to date these layers of the Earth using lots of different methods. So the way that evolution has progressed is by looking at the fossils that have come from different eras of the Earth, okay, and looking at the fossil evidence that's been gained from these different levels of the Earth, for lack of a better name, and identifying similarities and differences between them. Okay, this is how we're able to identify that 250 million years ago there was an extinction event unlike any that the Earth had seen before, because we got a whole bunch of organisms that we can identify here in these sorts of layers of the Earth, or at least in Earth that's dated to these layers, that then don't appear here. So, the question of, well, why? Why does an organism that existed here not appear here? Well, something must have eliminated it, okay? And this is where we get the extinction, the Permian extinction event. Same with the dinosaurs. How did we go from having these, thunderous land-based lizards roaming the Earth, to then essentially rodents taking over? Well, there must have been something that impacted their survival. We get this very clear division between these large lizards and then, the mammals inheriting the Earth. Okay, so all of this is very measurable, is an important thing to understand. Very, very measurable in the Earth. Okay. What's important when we're talking about how you could test evolution, a very simple test that Richard Dawkins actually talked about in the video you watched is, if you could show me an example of something that we would say only exists here in the evolutionary timeline, existing alongside something that would only exist in the Cambrian timeline, then evolution would be disproven. So in other words, if you can show me fossil evidence of a complex organism that we've only ever had evidence for up here at the end of the Cenozoic era, you find me a deposit that has that evidence sitting alongside something that we can only see in the Paleozoic era, or we've only measured in the Paleozoic era. Okay, you do that and you disprove evolution, undeniably. 100% it would be disproved. Okay, no one in the scientific community would argue that it's a valid theory if you can do that. Okay, if you can show an organism that existed here existing here as well. Okay, but it's worth noting that that's never happened in the history of archaeological evidence. We've never had a fossil that has crossed these sorts of major divides. Okay, and so what this suggests is that organisms did evolve, and you don't get very complex organisms existing with very basic ones. It just doesn't happen in the evolutionary timeline, because this complexity is born from the simplicity that we see down here. So it's through the natural selection and things like, drift, genetic drift that we see in these extinction events. It's through those events and those pressures that create the complex organisms, not vice versa. Okay, so hopefully that's been clear enough and you've got a bit of an understanding of evolution now if you didn't have one before. Let's now talk about Kuhn and Popper. Okay, so firstly, a quick summary of Kuhn's theory. So remember, we've got the process of scientific revolution up on the screen there, which, remember, Kuhn argued will result in a paradigm shift here at the revolution phase. So once a theory reaches crisis, other theories will be, or other hypotheses will be tested, essentially. And if we find one that best solves the problems, then that will be adopted into normal science. So remember, what ends up here is all about whether it solves problems. And the problem that we're really talking about with evolution is, how did we get here? How did we develop as humans? How did we originate? And why do we see so much variety in life on this planet? Okay, why do I get so much, so much variety of life? That's really the problem that we're trying to solve with the theory of evolution. Okay, so it's worth noting evolution is not a new theory. It's been around since the ancient world. The ancient Greeks talked about it, as did the ancient Chinese, and it was present in sort of the golden age of Islam, when Islam was the kind of the epicenter of intellectual discussion in the world. But the issue that we've got, a little bit like what we talked about with the heliocentric revolution, the sun-centered solar system, there was an external pressure, and there actually continues to be an external pressure on the acceptance of evolution as a scientific theory. Okay, and that external pressure comes in the form of what we might call the theory of creationism. Okay, so because in the Western world, at least, the church, the Christian church, and particularly the Catholic Church earlier on, as well as Islamic belief in the Middle East, because of the development of both of these and the influence that they both had on their respective societies, there's been a lot of pushback to the idea that humanity developed from a more basic animal organism. Okay, the big reason for this is it says that that's not what it says happened in the Old Testament. And remember, when we're talking about Christianity and Islam, both of them view the Old Testament as sources of divine revelation. So in other words, as the Word of God. Okay, in the Old Testament, we get the story of Genesis, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, etc., etc. Okay, and it's very clearly outlined there that God placed the animals on the earth, and that God placed mankind as it exists now on the earth and gave man dominion over the animals. Okay, so in other words, we were given dominance over the animal species. To suggest that we evolved from animals obviously goes against this belief. And so there's been a lot of societal pressure through the form of religious organizations pushing back against evolution as the explanation for humanity's development, okay, of how we got here. Um, Added to this, there's been some adjustments to timelines of evolution, and it's worth noting that there are still quite wide variations in the time periods that we're talking about in terms of how long it takes for evolution to occur, or for evolution to occur of a species. So what we're talking about from Kuhn's perspective is if we've got evolution, which is at the moment undeniably accepted as the scientific explanation for the development of life on the planet. Okay, this is normal science, but we have had adjustments going back and forward. Okay, and even today, because of new technologies being developed, because of our better understanding of DNA mutation, there's still disagreement about when our ancestors split from the Neanderthals. Okay, so Homo sapiens or modern humans and Neanderthals existed on the planet for quite a long time together, and there's plenty of evidence in our DNA that they actually interbred. Okay, so most humans on the planet, when you like screen their DNA, there's evidence that they've got a Neanderthal ancestor. Okay, so these tribes, we might call them, or breeds of humans, is probably a better way to discuss them, existed together and in certain cases lived together. Okay, but when did we get the separation? At what point did this division, okay, at what point did that happen? When did the Neanderthals go along that pathway and Homo sapiens go along this evolutionary pathway? Because up to this point, we're the same species. Same here. All right, different. How long ago did that occur? There's some researchers today who suggest that this split, okay, the development of Homo sapiens versus Neanderthals, occurred 300,000 years ago. There's others who suggest that it was 600,000 years ago. So this is quite a big separation. There's some debate around here as well. Okay, and this one, again, it's sort of a difference of doubling it, where when did the ancestor of the modern human, as well as the modern Neanderthal and other hominins, when did they separate from the common ancestor we hold with chimps? Okay. Some researchers argue that this is about 6.5 million years ago, others about 13 million years ago. Okay, so there's still lots of debate around when these divisions occur. And a lot of the time, this is used as evidence that evolution is not a scientific theory because of this debate. I mean, how can you have, something where one researcher says one thing and the other researcher says it's double that? Okay, this seems very unscientific. It's very non-specific. It's worth remembering that these changes are happening because of the development of new technologies. Okay, we are now able to screen DNA much better than we've ever been able to, and we'll continue to get better at it. So one of the things that leads to adjustment and then like tinkering, okay, of a theory is the development of new technologies. I mean, this happened with the telescope for the heliocentric view. This is very normal for a scientific theory, okay? And whilst 300 to 600,000 years or 6.5 to 13 million years might seem like a really, really, really big division, okay, or a really long time period, it's worth remembering we're talking about an evolutionary process that has been happening for 500 million years, if not more. Okay, about 2.5 billion years is the earliest signs of life that we've got. Very, very basic life. Okay, so we're talking about a process that has spanned 2.5 billion years. Okay, um, disagreeing on a couple of 100,000 years, whilst not um, it's not great, it would be better if we could have a set answer, is not actually a fundamental problem of evolution. It's just a problem of our measuring device. It would be like me saying, okay, well, how wide is something? Well, if I gave you just like a 30 centimeter ruler, then you'd be able to measure it. But if I like magnified it down and I use, digital technologies to measure it, I'd get a much finer measurement than that. Okay. And your measurement, whilst looking like it's correct using the 30 centimeter ruler, might be out by a long way using the digital measurement device. This is essentially how science works. As new technologies develop, we get new abilities to identify differences uh, and measure things much more accurately. Okay, it's worth noting that evolution has never reached a crisis point. Okay, there has never been a development or a discovery that has fundamentally rocked evolution where an adjustment to the theory hasn't allowed it to then be absorbed into the theory. An example of that sort of crisis point, as I said before, if we got fossil evidence of something that we thought should only exist here, existing down here, this would lead to a crisis in evolution, 100%. Okay, it would lead to this crisis point, and a new theory would have to be observed, okay, or at least considered. Um, so far, evolution has survived any sort of bumps in the road that's come up from new technologies or new fossil evidence. Okay, and what we've got is an understanding. So this is just a little, branch of the evolutionary timeline. It's the one that we exist on. Okay, and whilst all other hominid species have died out, so Homo sapien is the sole survivor here. We do still have lots of species along these other branches. Okay, so our closest living relatives are the chimpanzees and the bonobo monkeys, or chimps rather. And a chimpanzee shares about 95% of your DNA material. Okay, then you can see here that, okay, then the next step back is gorillas, the next step back is orangutans, etc., etc. Okay, so this is how evolution has mapped the development of humanity. And really, much like the heliocentric view, the thing that stopped it from progressing and being widely accepted is not a lack of scientific merit, it's external pressures. Okay, what about Popper? Popper's quite an interesting one when we talk about evolution. Popper spoke widely about evolution and initially argued that it is not a scientific theory because it lacks observable evidence. And particularly what he meant by this was, well, we cannot test natural selection because natural selection, by definition, means that there's no intervention by humans. And anytime I run an experiment, I'm intervening as a human because I'm running the experiment. So we can't possibly test that natural process. The other thing that Popper suggested was that because we're talking about something that happened a long, long, long time ago, arguably before the existence of humanity, there's no way that it could have been observed directly. And because we don't have direct observation of the process of evolution, in other words, there were no humans there to see the evolution of organisms leading to where we are now. Popper suggested that it therefore cannot be observed and can't be confirmed because of that. All right. It's worth noting that this is still an argument used by creationists. So people like Ken Ham, who is the curator of the Ark Museum. I know you can't see it, but I'm putting museum in very heavy talking marks there. He uses this argument as well, that no one was there to see this development. No one was there to see the fossils being put into the ground. No one was there to see the development of an organism from a basic entity into a complex one. And so therefore we can't confirm it because we can't possibly observe it. So when you look at it this way, there's a lot of merit to it. We can't possibly test it because that would mean we intervene in it and that changes it. And we can't possibly observe it because we're talking about a process that happened, 2.5 billion years ago. All right. So because of both of these factors, Karl Popper actually argued initially that evolution was not a scientific theory. He referred to it as a metaphysical explanation. So this is sort of like saying it's a cool idea. But because it's impossible to test, that means it's impossible to falsify. Okay, so it fails Popper's basic standard for a scientific theory, which is falsifiability. It doesn't need to be proven wrong, but it needs to have the ability to be proven wrong. Later, Popper admitted an error, and upon reflection, he did see the strength of evolution as a scientific theory to explain the development and diversity of life on the planet. And Popper did identify that, well, actually, there are very strict ways that we could prove evolution incorrect. Very, very, very specific tests that we could run that would disprove evolution. And every time those sorts of tests have been run, for example, the location of fossils, like I've been talking about, finding a complex fossil in the same level as a basic fossil, every time that's been attempted, it's never been shown. Okay, we've never disproven evolution through several attempts. So it's, as I've got in the second last dot point there, it's never failed a genuine test to falsify it. According to Popper's theory, evolution falls in the same category, therefore, as other scientific theories. So it is a falsifiable theory, it's just never been proven false. When we compare this to creationism, this is not a scientific theory, according to Popper's view. And the reason for this is there's no test that we could possibly run that would falsify creationism. So it is not a falsifiable theory. It doesn't make any risky predictions. There's nothing that I could present to someone like Ken Ham or there's nothing that Ken Ham could say that would allow me to actually test his view of creationism. Okay. The view is essentially, well, it's the word of God, and so therefore it's correct. Like that's fine for a belief, but when we're talking about a scientific theory, well, I need to be able to test that or observe that or measure that in some way. And there's really no way that I can do that. So this is what creates the division between the scientific theory of evolution versus the non-scientific belief-based creationism. Okay. All right. So what should you do now? Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of epistemology as an area of study. So I want you to begin preparing for your essay. We'll talk about this more later in the week. I'd start that by reviewing the readings on Kuhn and Popper. Look over your notes, and it's really time to decide which view of scientific development do you agree with more. Do you agree with Kuhn that science is really there to solve our problems, or do you agree with Popper that science is there to move us away from ignorance? Okay. It's time to decide sort of who you agree with or whether you agree with either of them. All right. Remember, there's no one correct answer here. I'm not going to be marking you higher if you say Kuhn over Popper or vice versa. It's about the reasoning that you give. Why do you agree with one over the other? Also, go back through your notes on epistemology and begin to integrate some of the things we learned earlier in the topic with Kuhn and Popper. So, for example, look at different types of knowledge. So you define lots of different types of knowledge, like necessary truths and those sorts of things. How do they fit into Kuhn and Popper's theory? Okay, where do they fit in this idea? And then I want you to complete some basic research about a scientific theory and a non-scientific theory so that you can use it as an example in your essay. I'll be asking you to provide an example of a theory. Okay. So this can be the ones that we've discussed through the readings and also today. So you can look at the geocentric revolution to the heliocentric one. The development and acceptance of Einstein's theory of relativity and why Popper thought that this was different to theories like Freud's psychoanalysis. What we've talked about today, evolution versus creationism. You can decide to do something else if you would like. So, for those of you studying psychology, phrenology versus, neural biology is a good one. But you don't need to become an expert in these. You just need to understand how they exist as examples of what science looks like versus what science does not look like. Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about this later in the week to get you ready for the essay. But hopefully this has been enlightening, and I'll see you in class. Wash your hands, everyone. Bye.